Thank you for joining us today for the 2025 Falvey Scholars Research Awards presentation. I'm Millicent Gaskell. I'm the Dean of Falvey Library, and I am privileged to serve as today's host. This event is co-sponsored by the library and the Center for Research and Fellowships. Falvey Scholars are chosen annually from members of the graduating senior class to recognize high achievement in undergraduate research and scholarship. The awards emphasize the role that the library resources and services play in support of research and academic success. In recognition of their accomplishments, we will be presenting each Falvey Scholar with a framed award, a digital gift card, and a gold cord to wear at commencement. Today, we're going to hear from seven presentations from 8 award-winning seniors. Each student group will be introduced and will provide a 10-minute summary of their research and their winning project. At the end of each presentation, there will be maybe around 5 minutes to ask questions. But before we begin, I'd like to welcome Father Peter Donahue, University President, to make a few remarks.
Thank you. So why are you all sitting so spread out? Come on, move up. Scott, come on, move up. Move up. Way in the back there. It's like church. It's like people in church sitting in the last row. Always have all these empty seats. It's an audience interaction. You have to react in some way or another. First of all, thank you, Nelson. Congratulations to all of you. We talk a lot here at the university about, joining together the heart and the mind, reason and faith. We try to look at how we do those things. And, it goes way beyond just textbooks. It goes way beyond just what you learn in a classroom or what you read or what you study. But it does really come to life when we engage in research. When we are people that are interested in doing scholarly research, scientific research, whatever it is that your field might be. That scholarship, that research is really something that begins to put flesh on the bone, so to speak. It enables us to fill out our knowledge. And it also helps us to discover new knowledge. It helps us to discover something new about ourselves, but most importantly about the world in which we live in. So to all of you, undergraduates, to be doing such kinds of research and doing such kind of work is amazing. I never thought of it when I was an undergraduate. I found it hard enough to do when I was a graduate student. So, but as you kind of explore this world of intellectual ideas and look at who you are and what you are and where you place yourself in the world, I hope that research will always be a part of your life. You will continue to explore new ideas, new thinkings, new ways of approaching things. The library staff does a great job at giving us resources to do that. And the Center for Undergraduate Research, none of them are here, but thank you for that as well. So, but congratulations to all of you. And as I said, I hope your exploration into the world of research and scholarship will continue to ignite you as you go into the future, and to really be something that not only enlightens your mind and your heart, but hearts and minds of other people that you encounter. So congratulations to all.
Thank you. I just want to say this is my favorite event of the year. I am always impressed by all of our students. So we're going to get it started. And so at this time, I'd like to welcome Dr. Chen-Hong Wu to come in and introduce our first scholar.
I want to introduce David Bates. David Bates is my worked with me started work with me like two and a half years ago, almost he started we have a program called ME Sophomore Research Scholar. So he started as a sophomore working with me, then continued as a junior research scholar, and he also took class with me, which was very hard, and he did very well, and I got an A, and he didn't even take final. So David has done excellent job, and he presented as the first author twice in American Physical Society Division of Fluid Dynamics annual meeting, which is considered to the best, not one of the best, it is the best conference in our field. And he also published a journal paper in physical real fluids, which is also like our committee's like a top journal, Q1 journal. The paper was selected and recently published several weeks ago. Was selected as the editor's suggestion, featured covered article, and was also picked by the editor, also by the American Physical Society to kind of put in the news outlet, things like that. All right, okay, David.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Wu, and thank you all for joining this afternoon. Today, I'll be presenting my research on brain concussion using a smart brain technology. To get started with a quick introduction to concussions and traumatic brain injury, or TBI. TBIs are caused by a sudden impact to the head from accidents such as falling, motor vehicle collisions, or for military personnel in combat. And TBIs are very complex, so understanding the mechanics behind them are necessary for uncovering better treatment techniques and prevention methods. But to do so, we need to first understand the composition of the human head. The head is comprised mainly of the soft matter squishy brain that's held within the hard outer rigid skull. And between these two, there exists a very thin gap called the subarachnoid space. And through this gap circulates a very water-like cerebrospinal fluid, or CSF. Also in this gap are very complex branching tree-like structures called trabeculae, which attach your brain to the inside of your skull. And the way CSF circulates through this trabeculae is necessary to consider in impact dynamics. Now, every impact has two components to it. First is the rotational component, as if your head were to whip forward into something. And second is the translational component, if your head were to fall linearly straight to the ground. So to understand the distinctions between the two, we've separated this into two experiments. First is the rotational impact experiment, where the overall goal is to uncover the behavior of a soft matter in a liquid environment. This will bridge the important knowledge gap of understanding the role cerebrospinal fluid plays in traumatic brain injury. To do this, we created the following experimental setup, which consists of a rigid frame to which a motor is mounted and rotates a transparent cylinder to induce rotational impacts. Inside that cylinder, we've synthesized a sphere that's made of hydrogel, which is a material with similar properties to the real brain, such as density and Young's modulus. This hydrogel ball is then suspended in a glycerin solution to simulate the CSF, and the experiment is recorded with a high-speed camera. What we can find is first, by tracking the markings on the left side of the cylinder, we can track the rate at which they pass to quantify the speed that the cylinder is spinning. Second, during key points in the experiment, we can outline the ball as an ellipse, taking the height and width dimensions to quantify its deformation across the state of the experiment. And what we find here is already some important results. As the experiment begins around time 0 at rest, there is 0 deformation within the ball. But then as the cylinder quickly accelerates, the ball deforms, sort of stretching along its axis of rotation, or the axial direction. It then maintains this deformation under steady rotation until around 6.5 seconds, when the cylinder begins to decelerate. Here, the deformation completely reverses, and it seems to be compressed in the axial direction, sort of squishing out to the walls of the cylinder. To understand why this is happening, we partnered with Virginia Tech, who developed a simulated model of this system. And when they put in the same parameters as our experiment, we see that the results agree very well with our experimental results. So with this verified theoretical framework, we can then look to the exterior pressure of the surrounding fluid and the angular velocity of the entire system to understand why this deformation is happening. First, this exterior pressure figure is a video that begins under steady rotation of the system, taken at the cross-section of the ball, which is this quarter circle in white. you can see during the steady rotation, there's a high pressure at the wall of the cylinder, which, due to centrifugal forces, then causes the ball to stretch out until the cylinder reaches rest and the pressure equalizes. Then, to understand the reversal of deformation, looking at the angular velocity, this again begins during steady rotation. But as the cylinder begins to decelerate, you can see the shape of the ball begin to appear, as its inertia causes it to decelerate at a slower rate than the surrounding fluid, causing it to sort of spin out of control towards the walls of the cylinder. What this tells us is that it's the deceleration stage of a rotational impact that could actually cause the highest amount of damage during an impact. And this is a key insight into future helmet design. Now moving to the translational impact experiment, our goal is to now incorporate this trabeculae structure into the smart brain to understand its role in overall impact dynamics. We've run a very similar experiment to this before without the trabeculae, which consisted of the same hydrogel material, this time cast into the proper geometry of the real brain, encased in a clear skull and filled with water. This is then all mounted on a frame with sliders so that the system can be lifted to a desired height and then dropped to the ground. When we ran this experiment without the trabeculae, we recorded it with a high-speed camera, and this is one of the results that we found. On impact, there was evidence of bubbles being formed in the region opposite of where the brain hit. This is a phenomenon called cavitation, when the pressure drops so low that these bubbles form until they collapse and create high-pressure spikes as they jet to the surface of the brain. So now we want to incorporate a trabeculae structure to answer two important knowledge gaps. First is how will the trabeculae affect the pressurization of these cavitation bubbles? And second is what is the role in the overall impact process? To do this, we added a thin layer of porous foam between the brain and the skull with similar permeability to the real brain trabeculae. Then by running the experiment twice, first with and then without the trabeculae, we can see some key results, as when both cases reach an impact, they both drop to negative 98 kilopascal, which is the absolute zero pressure when cavitation bubbles begin to form. They then remain at this zero pressure for an observed amount of time, where the cavitation bubbles are allowed to grow larger and larger and larger until they collapse at a critical point and create that high pressure jet towards the surface of the brain. What we see is after this jet, the case with the porous structure both accelerated the pressure recovery and also reduced the peak pressure. But to understand how it affects the overall impact process, we ran this experiment over 100 times, taking a look at two key parameters. First is these two peak pressures for the cases with and without trabeculae. And second is that duration of observed time that the bubbles are allowed to grow. This helps us answer the question, what is the role of trabeculae in the overall impact process? And what we found is, first, by looking at these peak pressures from the bubbles, is between 100 and 350 G, there's a very minimal difference. But then from 350 to 700 G, the case with the trabeculae exhibits higher pressures. But this reverses over 700 G, and then the trabeculae seems to cause lower pressures. So to understand why this is happening, we look to the observed time. And we see a very similar relationship, where between 350 and 700 G, the trabeculae increase the amount of time the bubbles have to grow. But then, for some reason above 700 G, this reverses, and the trabeculae seems to limit the amount of time the bubbles have to grow. To understand why this is happening, we looked back to the composition of the head with trabeculae, and realized that between 350 and 700 G, this is a critical zone where the trabeculae essentially act as tiny springs connecting your brain to your skull. So on an impact, it dampens the motion of the brain, allowing more time for the bubbles to grow, creating a higher pressure explosion. But then above 700 G, the CSF begins to behave completely differently, like if you were to dive off of a high place into water. At some point, the fluid begins to act like a solid and completely limits the brain's motion. And then the trabeculae effectively maximizes the amount of space the bubbles have to grow and limits the pressure exerted on the brain. So what we found overall is below 350 G, trabeculae had a minimal influence on pressure dynamics. But then between 350 and 700, they increase the pressures, which could possibly increase brain injury risk. But then above 700 G, they have a positive effect, likely reducing this injury. Lastly, I would like to thank the National Science Foundation for supporting this research, and a special thank you to the Villanova University Department of Mechanical Engineering for supporting me to be on this project through the sophomore and junior match programs. Thank you.
About 5 minutes for questions.
So very interesting work. The data that you showed us, the cutoff at 700 seemed a little bit arbitrary. Could it possibly be happening before then? And how did you pick this 700 threshold?
This figure here,
Yes.
700 was, there is sort of a indistinct threshold, mainly with the observed time where we see this. So for presentation's sake, we choose a nice round number. But the increases with these drops are so close together, like moving up such small increments in distance, that was the main range that we chose.
If you do future work on this, there are statistical techniques trying to figure out where there's a break in a statistical series, and that might be interesting to apply.
Yes, absolutely. That's something we are continuing to improve this experiment with the adhesion of the trabeculae to the brain in the skull. So that is absolutely something we can look at. Thank you.
Anyone else? All right, well, thank you very much, David. Award and your report for graduation. Thank you. Okay. So next, I'm going to invite Dr. Samantha Chapman to introduce our next scholar.
Thank you so much, Millicent, for having us. It's a really awesome thing. So it is my great pleasure to introduce Max Ridma today. So Max comes to us from Muncie, Pennsylvania, a small town where he came in great proximity to the natural environment and where he sort of learned to love and be part of that environment. So Max, is the youngest of 4 siblings, 3 of whom came to Villanova, so his graduation will certainly be a special one for his family. And he has a really diverse interest, like lots of good students, right? He's really into making and listening to and producing and branding music, which is really amazing to a science nerd like me. And he's also incredibly good at research. So Max has been working with me for 2 years now, messing around in the mucky marshes and mangroves of Florida, but also doing lots of lab work. He's also had experiences while being here at Villanova working. He did an internship at Penn last summer to do immunology, totally different kind of biology. And then he also has been a science writer. So as you can see, Max is really diverse. I've mentored many research students at this point, and I have to say, like, the most important quality in one is this ability to sort of have things thrown at you and then figure out what the next questions are. And I have to say that Max is definitely one of the best at doing that. He's learned ArcGIS, really sophisticated statistical techniques, and he just takes that technique and then says, like, now what do we do, or what's the next step? And I think that's really admirable and unique, and so I look forward to seeing his great career in the future. Take it away.
Thank you, Sam. And thank you everyone for being here. It's a great honor to be able to speak here with you all today. Thank you to the Falvey Library for hosting this event. So for my research for the past couple of years, I've been looking at the drivers of mangrove encroachment in a newly colonized Florida wetland and how climate change is affecting these wetlands. So for some background, it's important to talk about first what coastal wetlands are. So they're located all around the world in tropical and subtropical climate zones. You see the picture on the top that shows where they're located. They're extremely diverse, and they provide a lot of different ecosystem services that a lot of the time we take for granted. So for one, they're a massive carbon sink, meaning they store lots of carbon and absorb lots of carbon. They're diverse and are home to many different species. And they also build elevation to protect our coasts. And all of these combine and give great economic value. So money that we'd have to spend on restoring these wetlands provide for themselves and are a great asset to us. But they're changing as a result of climate change. And one of these changes that we are seeing is mangrove trees, which are an invasive species, are encroaching into some of these sites. So from this, we're seeing an increase in global surface temperature, and this is bringing with it extreme freeze event, or a decrease in extreme freeze events. So if we look at the graph to the left, the x-axis is showing time, y-axis on the top is showing the minimum temperature. And this data is from Daytona Beach, which is close to our site. You can see on top, the minimum temperature has increased over time. And if we move to the bottom, the annual amount of freezing days has also decreased. So the combination of these two have made the polar expansion of mangroves more possible and more frequent. So the combination of this with an increased intensity and frequency of storms, which is as a result of climate change, we're starting to see these mangroves move into these environments. So it's the picture on the left. This is what we picture a traditional low stature marsh. However, we're starting to see more of mangroves move into these environments, which are pictured in the middle and the right. And from this, we're seeing a shift in dominance. So this picture in the background does a good job of showing how these mangroves are moving in. So they usually get to the site by the river, and they get deposited. Then as time goes on, they move further and further inland and into the interior of the marsh. And with this, they get different hydrological positions, which is basically just their location to the river. And this brings about different growth patterns as well as behaviors in these mangroves. And the main factor that's driving this is the tide. So those closer to the riverside behave differently than those further inland. And a couple of the main ways that are different is through freeze resistance, growth and inundation, as well as nutrient availability. So those closer to the riverside have lower elevations, and this leaves them more prone to being covered by water and inundated, which in turn makes them die if they're covered by water and drown. So they need to grow taller, and this works out because there's more nutrients readily available at the riverside, because as nutrients are run off into the river, it goes more closely by the riverside, and these mangroves can access these nutrients more frequently. So with this in mind, my study goals, I'm looking to identify the differences between the platform and riverside hydrological locations. So platform is just another word for the interior, whereas riverside is closer to the river. And once we can identify what these are, we're trying to figure out what are the main factors in terms of their distribution and growth differences. So to do this, the study site that we're working at is called Valencia. It's located in St. Johns County, Florida. And it's a part of the GTM-NERR, which is the research reserve of this location. And we collected data here at 3 different time points, once in May, once in October, and once in February. And we set up these plots to measure a couple of different variables. So we separated these plots first by hydrological location, so how close they are to the river. So platform, inland, riverside is close to the river. Vegetation type as well. We separated by marsh and mangrove. And then finally, we also looked at a treatment with fertilization. However, we found that the fertilization treatment didn't have much of an effect due to the recency of this site. And we repeated this treatment 5 times. So the picture up top does a good job of showing what we're measuring and how we did this. So the main factors we were looking at were elevation, mangrove dimensions, which is pictured here on the right. We measured that with the meter stick. Root ingrowth, which we planted, and then pulled out when we came to collect data and brought it back to the lab and measured their weight. And finally, ammonium concentration, which is representative of the nutrients of the areas. So we did this with poor water well samples, and we use ammonium because this is the most readily available form of nitrogen for wetlands. and nitrogen is a very valuable aspect that helps plants grow. So from our results, it's first important to identify when these mangroves got here. So this picture is from 2017. There aren't any mangroves here at this time. However, if you fast forward to 2023, all these red dots represent where mangroves are now. And it's thought that these got here after Hurricane Irma. So the propagules, which are their seeds, were probably deposited into the river and brought up to this more northern site. And proof that Hurricane Irma came through here, this picture from 2017, you can see the boardwalk in the blown up picture. However, in 2023, it's not there, and it's because it was blown away, washed away. So first, it's important to identify and establish that mangroves do have elevation differences at the platform and riverside. So looking at the graph on the right, we separated by location on the x-axis and elevation in meters on the y. And you can see the clear difference between platform and riverside. This is further conveyed through the figure on the left. You can see the smaller dots are representative of those with smaller elevations, whereas the ones with bigger dots are higher elevations. And the smaller elevations are more frequent at the riverside compared to the platform. So next, we measured the above ground growth, and we did this by looking at height as well as canopy area. So if we're looking at the graph on the left, the height, you can see that riverside had more growth compared to platform. And this was significantly different. However, if we look at canopy area, the numbers are pretty different in terms of the mean. However, we didn't find this to be statistically significant, most likely just through variation. And this makes sense because, like I talked about earlier, those located at the riverside are more likely to be covered by water and inundated. So it's important that they grow over this threshold and get above the certain sea level rise. So just as you can learn a lot about above ground growth, it's also important to look at the low ground growth. So this is showing the root biomass in grams on the y-axis, and we separated this out by vegetation as well as segment. So segment means that 0 to 15 is the first 15 centimeters of the soil, and 15 to 30 is the next 15. Main thing to take away from this is that the root biomass varies with depth as well as the location that it's at. And a good example of this is at the platform level from 0 to 15. In mangroves, you can see that the abundance is relatively high in terms of root biomass compared to the rest. But if we're looking at riverside, it seems that they grow deeper in comparison to those at the platform. And maybe most notably for this location in this graph, you can look at platform from 15 to 30. And you can see that there's a significant drop-off compared to the rest. And we think this is because of when we took these soil cores, there was a big deposit of sand here. And as we pulled it out, there weren't really many roots because mangroves roots don't like to grow in sand. Finally, the last thing that we looked at was pore water ammonium concentration. Again, ammonium is the most readily available form of nitrogen in wetlands. And we separated this out by vegetation again, as well as date. A lot of studies find that nutrients do have a significant impact on the growth differences. However, we didn't really see this. We think it might just be due to the recency of mangroves moving in here. But a takeaway is that there's a lot of seasonal variation. Looking at May and February, you can see that May is almost the opposite of February. So we could expect to see more of a distinct trend in the future. However, for now, we're just going to assume that seasonal variation doesn't give much of an impact on nutrients. So what does this mean in terms of the data? So the main things to take away are that hurricanes promote the dispersion of mangroves. However, it is the local sites and local environments that determine how they ultimately grow and survive. And we found that elevation was the main driving factor between the differences here. So this graph on the right supports this. The x-axis is showing elevation, and y is showing. We're mainly focusing on abundance. And just a reminder, the data that we found, the mangroves fell between 0.7 and 0.5 meters of elevation. And this falls right between the realized niche of mangroves. So with this, we're expected to see more of a spread and dominance of mangroves in these marsh areas. So although this seems like a bad thing, I know I said mangroves are invasive, they do provide a lot of valuable ecosystem services that marshes do not. So they're more effective at building elevation, attenuating waves, storing carbon, and absorbing nutrients. I think a fascinating finding is that they prevent erosion at a 470% higher rate than marshes in some locations. So although this is a not natural way of these ecosystems functioning, it's showing that our Earth is fighting back against climate change. And there are some positives. However, there are negatives as well. As these mangroves move in, they could overtake these marshes and decrease the amount of diversity and overtake the native species. However, I think it's going to be important to look at these as years go on and see whether or not the positives outweigh the negatives. So thank you. I'd like to open the floor to questions or any discussion that you have.
Well, great talk, Max. So I was just curious, your thoughts with these mangroves coming in. Do you think they're going to be able to help the marsh platform outcompete sea level rise? So are they going to be able to help stabilize the sediments and help that? And do you think that's going to happen at your site?
I think yes. It seems that, like I said, the ones closer to the riverside they're more of the ones that are at risk to be covered by sea level rise. However, the ones at the platform seem to be doing well. But I think the one thing to keep an eye on is, like I said, from the 15 to 30 centimeter segment, there's really not much root growth. And this could have implications on how well they survive, like in terms of if the sea level gets too high in like a hurricane or something, it could come through and wash them all out if they're not stable enough. So we'll have to see. I think that's though.
Awesome, thank you.
So, is this a good thing or a bad thing? I don't know. You said both ways.
Yeah, I think it's up for interpretation. Obviously, the stats kind of speak for themselves, where they're more effective than marsh at doing these things. But just like any invasive species, if they come in and overtake what's already existing, we could see a lot of changes in terms of biodiversity of certain species.
So should they be removed?
I think it's kind of too early to tell. At least at this site, they're just moving in. It's been 10 years about since they've been here. But I'm on the side of no. I think climate change has gotten bad enough to where we need to take what we can get. And this is kind of a way that, without having to do too much policy, it's just kind of happening on its own. So.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right. So it's my pleasure to introduce our next Falvey Scholar, Emma Cronenberg, on behalf of her faculty member, Dr. Caitlin Yantis, who is unable to be here with us today. So Dr. Yantis wrote the following about Emma. I have had the pleasure of working with Emma since she joined my research lab about 2 years ago. From the beginning, Emma demonstrated all the best qualities you want to have in a teammate. Smart, conscientious, dependable, plus more, and including being an incredibly kind, respectful, and passionate about her work. Emma is one of the busiest students I've ever worked with, and I'm not sure if she could be more involved if she tried. Yet she balances all of her commitments seamlessly, or at least she seems that way. Emma put a tremendous amount of thought and care into her thesis project, resulting in a study with sound design and hypotheses that are well supported by psychological theory. Emma even incorporated her own interest in higher education and student affairs by measuring Villanova's students' anticipated sense of community amid potential campus changes. Emma, I am so proud of you and all that you have accomplished. You are so deserving of this incredible award, and I cannot wait to see what you do next. Emma?
All right, thank you again for that introduction. So again, my name is Emma, and I'm going to be talking about my honors project for my senior thesis, which is Moving Beyond Villanova, White Students' Psychological Responses to Increasing Racial Diversity on Campus. So to give kind of some background, over the past few decades, there have been projections that the United States will become a majority minority. What this means is that the sum of all those in minority groups will outnumber those in white populations. So it's not that any one minority group will become bigger or more dominant than the white population, but just the sum. This has been reported both in popular media as well as scientific literature, and what's important to realize is that the scope of diversity can change what it means to be an American, can change what it means for each of our own identities. So traditionally, American identity has been defined according to white societal standards and white normativity. With increasing diversity, this could change. So what it means to be an American would no longer fall back on what it means to be white. And this changes a lot of the privileges that white individuals have experienced, changes our diversity, equity, and inclusion basis. So specifically, when individuals have tested this majority-minority phenomenon and exposed white individuals to this, they report a lot of psychological threats, which are entities that are perceived to likely cause harm or damage. It's important to notice that these are not necessarily true. They are just perceived to cause harm, but they can still be very impactful and salient on behavior, which I can show later. There are many psychological threats that you can think of. One is resource threat, and that's probably kind of the most easily come to mind. For example, the myth that immigrants are taking white American jobs or something like that would be considered a resource threat. I'm going to talk specifically about two psychological threats. The first one being prototypicality threat. So this is a changing sense of what it means to be a superordinate group. So as I said, American culture has been defined by white normativity for centuries upon centuries. That might change so that the prototypical American will no longer be white. And with that prototype comes a lot of decreased stigma, ease of moving about the world, representation in media that we see a lot. So that can be perceived as a psychological threat. The second one is perceived victimhood, and this is perceptions of anti-white discrimination. It's important to note this is, again, not a true thing in itself. Anti-white discrimination is a paradox because discrimination happens against marginalized individuals. But individuals might seem that they're being discriminated against based on their skin color. For example, like, I didn't get the job because I was white or something like that. And so moving on, it's important to recognize that it's not just that they stay in our head, they're materialized in our world and manifested. And so what does this look like? So greater psychological threats have been reported as increasing levels of fear and anger at minority groups, which can further position sort of an us versus them mindset and some xenophobia that we see around our society today. It also increases interracial tensions and conflict. So even a perceived sense of increasing diversity, for example, if an individual perceives that their neighborhood is becoming more diverse because of a singular person of color moved into the neighborhood, this can increase interracial tension, conflict, and lead to kind of more hostile environments. And then lastly, it's been shown to be correlated with a conservative shift. So individuals experiencing or like being made aware of this majority-minority phenomena are more likely to endorse conservative policies and less likely to endorse liberal policies. So for example, affirmative action is one. Support of affirmative action goes down when individuals are exposed to this majority-minority. So everything I've talked about so far has been studied on a national level. Again, the idea that the United States is changing. But really what that's going to look like is it's going to affect us on a day in and day out basis at our local levels. So this includes our neighborhoods, our schools, our workplaces, our places of worship. This study specifically chooses to look at schools, specifically higher education institutions. Universities are very unique, as any community is, but particularly because we have a high sense of homogeneity in our community. Education level, oftentimes socioeconomic status, age certainly plays into that. We exist in the greater socio-historical context, and yet we have our own mission values, which I'll talk about later too. And they're often considered like a hotbed for liberalism, for political activism. So what does that look like at an institutional level? So my study chooses to focus on the institution most of us call home, which is Villanova University. Villanova University is a predominantly white institution, which means that over 50% of its student population is white. Based on 2024 data of 2023, 68.3% of our undergrad population was white. So there's kind of the breakdown there. And yet at the same time, we like to recognize diversity as an integral component of all of our experiences and all of our development. You can ask, how can these kind of two things exist at once, and what tension is there? Additionally, talk about tension. Community is something that, as Father Peter says here, we not only talk about but strive for. It involves a deep sense of belonging. Studies have shown that community is often based on likeness and similarity. And so what does it look like when individuals are not like you, and yet we're still trying to build that sense of community? So my research question was, given Villanova's public endorsement of diversity and commitment to community, how might white Villanova students themselves respond to changing demographics on our campus? So my hypotheses were based on the trends seen at a national level, and I used a manipulation that was used in 2014 and replicating studies, again, on a national level. So first, I hypothesized that students are exposed to a racial shift, so the idea that Villanova will become a majority-minority campus, as compared to the idea of a future geographic shift, which is just that Villanova would become a majority-minority campus in terms of like people not from New Jersey, for example. So that's kind of less politically active, like less politically tensioned, race-neutral, and still a shift in demographics. So those exposed to that racial shift would experience a lower sense of community, and again, this is that novel measure specific to higher education institutions. Greater fears and perceptions of psychological threats, and then fewer financial resources, and will allocate fewer financial resources to race-related programs, so mimicking that conservative shift. That one's a little more complex, so I'm going to hold off on talking about it for the sake of time, but if anyone has questions, I'm happy to talk about it. So our participants are white Villanova undergraduate students. They were recruited via SONA, which is our psychology research management platform, and they were awarded course credit or $10. It's important to note that we're still in data collection right now, so this is only preliminary results. Our target sample size from a G-Power analysis, which is just like this statistical tool, says that for our effect size, we need about 400 participants to see a significant effect. We're about halfway through, so it makes sense when you see our results. And our demographics are about 19 years in age. You'll see overwhelmingly more females than males. And noting on a scale from very liberal to very conservative, they lean slightly more conservative. And yet at the same time, comparing us to Americans on a national level with a Gallup poll, we are more liberal than the typical American. So here's what they were exposed to. Individuals were randomly assigned either to experience this racial shift, and there was text that accompanied this, talking about explaining it and everything. Or again, this geographic shift, so looking at not from the mid-Atlantic. Although the data was the same, the 2023 was again based on Villanova actual data, the 2060 was just manipulated to produce a salient change. So now talking a little bit about, again, our preliminary results, sense of community, which is our connection to each other and to the university, was adapted again from a validated scale because it hasn't been used in this literature before. It was 12 items ranked from strongly disagree to strongly agree, so higher values would mean more sense of community. An example is I belong at Villanova. And students were asked to answer this as if they were a student in 2060. So here are results. You can see almost identical. Good thing is, sense of community is high in both instances. There's no significance yet, but again, our effect size isn't projected for later on. And we can see that Villanovans have an overall strong sense of community compared to, again, other colleges that have used this on a non-race related level. And then perceived threat was prototypicality threat, so again, ranked from strongly disagree to strongly agree. An example was, I worry that in the future, people like me will no longer represent what it means to be an American. And perceived victimhood, again, this is that anti-white discrimination. This was, again, adapted for the university level. We used university-specific domains, such as, in the future of Villanova, how likely is it that people like you will face discrimination in admissions, in jobs, and that kind of thing. So our preliminary results, perceived victimhood, you can see slightly that the racial shift has a higher self-report of it, so participants expect that they will experience more anti-white discrimination. It's not significant yet, but it's trending in that direction. And then prototypicality threat is about even, so not significant as well at this current stage. So moving into our discussion, again, this is based on tentative results, and we expect our effect size, or we expect our effects will increase when we have a larger sample size. But the real question is, do national psychological threats parallel the threats happening at Villanova University? Right now, preliminary, it seems like they don't, which is a great sign. That means that Villanovans maybe are more welcoming of students of color, of students of other diverse backgrounds. That said, that could be because of our mission values, like we said, Unitas, Veritas, Caritas. It could be because maybe psychological threat is not as like exposed on a local level versus a national level when you think about the sheer amount of like millions of people changing versus thousands of people changing. Or it could also be because of response bias. Villanovans are very well versed in diversity, equity, and inclusion language, so they might be able to see through this and not want to appear prejudiced. There's also limited saliency of manipulation. So like I said, all students were expected to answer as if they were a student in 2060. They won't be a student in 2060. Nationwide, though, when they do the national studies, you will still be an American in 2060. So it's difficult to kind of put yourself in that mindset. And then lastly, it's important to note how changing political environments might affect the way that diversity is played out on a national level and a local level in the coming years. And so it's important to recognize not only what governments say, what institutions say, but what individuals themselves say and how these can either facilitate greater sustainable diversity or how they are barriers to and how we can ameliorate them. So looking forward, we look to continue data collection, final data analysis, and publish a manuscript. I'd like to thank Dr. Yantis, Cheryl Morris, and the Honors Program, my RIDE Lab, which is the Racial Identity, Diversity, and Equity Lab, and the Falvey Memorial Library for this opportunity. I'll leave time for a few questions, but if anyone wants more information or wants to talk, there's my contact information. Thank you.
Questions? So you were talking about how we compare to national data. Did age factor into this comparison since your survey was a 19-year-old?
Mm-hmm.
Does that make a difference in comparison with the national averages?
Yeah, so the national studies have been going on for years and years, and they've used a variety of populations, and that's kind of the effect has held up. So for example, there have been some studies that use college students because, I don't know, they're easily accessible, but it's not specific to a college campus, so they'll put it out like nationwide to all of like the State University of New York or something, or that kind of thing. And yet that's still, you see those psychological threats pop up. This is the first study that we've seen that's specific to a local community and specific to a school. And again, we're not seeing those results yet, so that could be a characteristic of not just the age, but of our like community here.
I also have another question about sample size. So as you continue, are you going to look for more male students? Because I know it's predominantly female, so that like skewed the results.
Yeah, so that's tricky too. It's in an ideal world, we would have equal genders, equal ethnicities, or I guess all of our students are right here, but equal religious affiliations. But we can't really like screen for that ahead of time. In fact, like any student is welcome to participate in our survey. We have 300 results, but 120 of those are Black students, Asian students, Hispanic students. So those were, like, we couldn't screen for those initially. So hopefully some more guys will show up, but that is something to note that the effects could be skewed based on gender.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Do you have, in your final sample, are you expecting enough power to be able to look at heterogeneity across religious background, gender? Another one that I thought might be interesting is what the person chooses, whether they take the $10 or the course credit.
So yes, we did collect a lot of demographic information, so including their self-reported, like political affiliation, their gender, their socioeconomic status, that kind of thing. That we do plan to look and do some meta-analyses once we have all of the data. The course credit or the $10 one is kind of specific. They know going in. So any general psychology student just at Villanova has to complete a certain amount of studies to participate. So that's where we got many of our students from. And then the $10 was just anyone else who wanted to do it too. So we do have, our data right now is primarily those course participation students. We just started opening up that for money within the last 2 months. Peter?
This is asking you to speculate on something you may not choose to speculate on.
Okay.
With the political climate as it is right now, and the talk of decreasing or getting rid of any conversations of DEI, what effect do you think that would have on people?
Yeah, I think that's tricky because, again, there's always a tension between what institutional and governmental and like companies say and what students and people and Americans are actually feeling. I think what's important about this is that it's starting the conversation, but it's not finishing it. Just on a practical level, I don't know that diversity can be achieved just through talking about it. I think the affirmative action policies, the policies for Pell Grants and that kind of thing are really important in bringing those students to our campus because these conversations can't happen if it's 100% white. But then I think it's really what will change a lot that's within our control is the way we're talking about this and the way that we are approaching people of color if you're a white individual or white individuals if you're a person of color. And for me, I'm hoping that, again, because we're slightly more liberal, because we're college students, because we have these values of truth, unity, and love, like hopefully we'll continue these conversations. But again, it's speculation, so.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, did you collect any information on like majors or anything like that?
We did not, yes. So that is a good point. So yeah, because there's definitely stereotypes and different senses of like other individuals might have different priorities, like a business student might have different priorities from a gender and women's studies student or anything like that. We didn't collect majors, and that is a limitation because many of our students are psychology students or psychology minded, again, because they're using that for course participation credit. So they at least had to sign up for general psychology, so that's a limitation.
All right, thank you, everybody.
You're welcome.
Okay.
Next, I'd like to invite Dr. Christopher Kilby up to introduce our next scholar.
Thank you very much. I'm actually just a stand-in today. Dorian was supervised by Dr. Laura Mines-and-Dick, who I think is at a conference today, which is why I'm here. I know Dorian, however, as he was a star student in my game theory course, and also he's been working tirelessly as my course intern in econometrics. The skills he honed there, I guess holding countless office hours with students who are struggling with statistical methods, are on display in the research that he's presenting today. That research is using cutting-edge techniques to analyze the impact of an aging population on the economy, focusing specifically on labor productivity. Building on recent research in a leading economics journal, Dorian extends the analysis from the domestic level that paper was analyzing to look at a global sample. And so I'm delighted to turn it over to Dorian.
Thank you, Dr. Kilby. Thank you, Falvey Library, for hosting this. I think with that description, we can go right to my results, right? I'm just kidding. I know you want to learn all about my stat methods. All right. So, as Dr. Kilby mentioned, my research is looking at the aging workforce in OECD nations and the effect that it has on labor productivity and economic growth in general. Now, when you think about the demographic shift in the United States, what exactly is that? Well, if you look at this table here, this is called a population pyramid. It represents the youngest cohorts of individuals, so maybe people 0 to 9 at the very bottom, and then as you go up, it's older cohorts. And a healthy population pyramid kind of tapers off as people age, just naturally. The problem is, in the United States now, this is what our pyramids look like. We have a huge bloat in the middle as people are living longer, and then we even see a little bit of tapering down as we get to the younger generations, which means people are having less kids now than they were 5, 10, 20 years ago. This is causing a real problem for economic growth, productivity, and the economy in general. We think that's because birth rates are declining. Now, birth rates are calculated in terms of total fertility rate, which means that there's a number of births per woman in a certain country that you're studying. To have replacement, you need 2.1 births per woman. In the United States, it's 1.67 now, so pretty dramatically lower than what we need. There's a lot of literature about the effects that aging can have on economic growth, on productivity. The paper that Dr. Kilby mentioned is the one at the very top that I emulate. They estimate that a 10% increase in the share of people who are over the age of 60 in a country, specifically the United States, is causing a 5.5% decline in GDP per capita in the United States. That's pretty dramatic. There's a lot of literature about the connection between productivity, aging, and economic growth, but they're all really looking at the United States besides this one study by AR et al., which uses the same mechanism that the first study uses and that I continue in this paper. Now, there are some things that can counteract this. Everybody is talking about AI right now, and there's no studies on AI yet, but I'm sure they're going to expand on it. There's a paper done by Nobel laureate Daron Acemoglu talking about the developments in automation and how that can offset the effects of aging. And then there's the idea of capital deepening, which means that as countries develop, they become more dependent on capital and less on labor. And so the fact that we have an aging population that might be getting less productive is not so important because we're more dependent on capital. The fact is, this is just a compensating factor. If you look at the green line, that's where our productivity could be over time if we didn't have the effect of aging. But since we have this aging population, we're looking at this orange line. And it's dramatically lower because the aging population is pulling everything down. It's serving as a dampening factor. So while it is totally true that AI is making us more productive, we still have this dampening factor bringing everything down, and we could be more productive. So now, all of these papers, as I mentioned, are really looking on a national scale. But I was wondering, why aren't we expanding this globally? When you look at population tables across the world, here's South Korea, here's Japan, here's Italy, and here's the entire OECD. These countries are in really bad shape in terms of the way the demographic shift is affecting their population. And then here's their total fertility rate across the entire OECD. As a reminder, there's where the 2.1 replacement rate is. Across the OECD, we are far below that, and we're looking at a crisis loop. Now, just a little information about the OECD. It's a collection of 38 countries that are considered the developed countries in the world. 28 of those are in Europe, and then we have an even spread across different regions: North America, South America, Oceania, and Asia. But of course, a vast concentration of those in Europe. I use data from 3 different sources. The Total Economy Database, published by the Conference Board, gives me the labor productivity figures that I'm really interested in. I also use the US Census International Database, and this is cool because it gives me the exact population at every single age in a given year. So if I want to know how many 20-year-olds there are in the United States in the year 1990, it'll give me that number across every single country in the OECD. It's pretty fantastic. And then I use another source, the Penn World Tables, for my numbers on GDP and total factor productivity, which is including capital and labor. Just to visualize it, here's my 2 indicators of labor productivity growth over time, and then the middle is my total factor productivity growth over time. Just to show you guys, since the 1940s, we have a steady decline in all 3 of those. There is a dramatic effect, and we're going to see if aging has an effect on that. In order to do this study, there's a lot of problems that we have to overcome. Across the world, there's going to be a lot of differences between pension systems, between healthcare systems and industries, even cultural practices across different countries that relate to health. But the big one is migration. If I'm trying to study a certain population and how that population ages over time, and the effect that has on productivity or economic growth, and at the same time we have migration from other regions, that migrants are generally younger than the current population, that's going to muddy the water and make working with the data really difficult. So what I do to overcome this is I use this really powerful econometric tool called an instrumental variable. And doing that allows me to strip away all of the noise in this data that comes about as a result of the migration, as a result of the pension systems and the cultural practices. All of that is stripped out as long as I meet a couple assumptions that I met in this paper. This is the specification that I used. So I'm looking at the percent change in productivity on the instrumental variable that I just mentioned. And then I also control for differences in years and then difference in geographic region, either country or regionally. And then here's what I found. So using the same indicator in that Mayas-Das et al. Paper, the 10% increase in the share of people age 60 plus, we're looking at around a 3.5 percentage point decline in labor productivity growth per hour per worker. We're looking at a 3.75 percentage point decline in labor productivity growth in GDP. And that's really dramatic because if you think in a typical year, GDP growth is about 2%. And so we're looking at a stronger decline than we have growth in a typical year. So this, without any other factors, is a recessionary force. And then we also see declines in total factor productivity across both indexes. So long story short, this is really bad. After this, I looked at each country individually because I was thinking there are members in the OECD, like the United States, that are very old, they have very mature economies, and so they follow a certain type of growth model. That's just what mature economies do. They grow in a certain way, but younger economies grow in a different way naturally. And so we have members of the OECD, like Chile, like Colombia, that joined more recently. And so the data that I'm using, since it's older, it might be indicative of the older growth path and not so much the developed growth path that I'm trying to study. And so in order to compensate for this, I stratified according to how long this country has been in the OECD. And I find that when you isolate just the founding members, you have a super strong effect in growth in productivity and growth in GDP. We had, for example, on this slide, you see the percent in GDP growth for the entire OECD was 3.75 percentage point decline. Now we're looking at negative 6.5. So dramatically larger, dramatically worse for developed countries. That's us. And so it's just really bad. That's all this says. Some future work has to be done. I'd like to estimate the effect that retirements specifically have on this because there's a lot of mechanisms, and the use of this instrument makes it difficult to parse out what the mechanism that's causing this is. All we just know is that it's aging in general, but there's like sub-mechanisms within aging that can be causing this. And so I'd like to do more research into that. But the big one is that GDP can be problematic at times. If you have ever been babysat by your grandparents, your parents probably didn't pay your grandparents for that, but that counted as labor, and that was output. And so technically that should go into GDP, but your grandparents are going to charge your parents a bill for the couple of hours that they did babysitting, so it doesn't go into GDP. When we have shifts from paid labor to unpaid labor or vice versa, it can kind of twist the GDP number around and make it really difficult to evaluate these kinds of changes. And when we're thinking about older populations, this problem could be even stronger. So future research should look into the changes between paid and unpaid labor and try to compensate for that. That said, what can we do about this? So the first thing everybody talks about is immigration, right? I stripped out immigration from this to find the effect. Can immigration be a solution? Not really. When immigrants come to a country, they generally are younger, they generally are more productive, and so they do boost short-term productivity. So they are a short-term solution. But when immigrants come to a certain country, they tend to assimilate to the demographic patterns in that country. For example, people that come to the United States in their home country, they might have 4, 5, or 6 kids. When they come here, structural changes, structural effects in the United States force them to only have 1 or 2, just like parents in the United States are doing. So they assimilate, and they're not fixing the problem that is total fertility rate. And also, if we want to think about immigration as a consistent flow to supplement our workforce, that can be really problematic, and there's a lot of ethical, exploitative issues that come with that. So we don't really want to look at that as a long-term solution to this problem. The other things that countries do, and across the board, is instill pro-natalist policies. These are things like a child tax credit that your parents might be receiving, paid maternity and paternity leave, propaganda campaigns. In China, they say that it's patriotic to have children because they're trying to break the mold of the one-child policy. Things like that. But again, these are not very successful. Why? Because they're invasive. Nobody wants to be told to have more children. And even a $500 check isn't going to change that. And so these policies, they might have a small effect. They might mitigate some problems. But they're invasive and they're not a long-term solution. What I'm proposing is that we have to look at those long-term problems that are causing people to have less children. When you think it costs $25,000 to have a kid at a hospital, that's a problem. we need to address the reason that that is. Healthcare needs to become more affordable, income inequality needs to be addressed, and when those structural issues that cause people to have less children are addressed, this long-term crisis that is going to affect our productivity and our GDP growth, that can be addressed as well. Thank you very much.
Questions?
Could increased AI use be a potential solution for this issue?
Yes, so like I was talking about with automation, AI can definitely offset some of these problems, but it's not a long-term solution because automation, AI, anything like that that supplements the worker, you have to assume that the worker is able to integrate that, and there's literature on when people age, they're less able to integrate with new technology, so that might make the labor productivity and the productivity of that capital implementation lower than it should otherwise be. But even if it's perfectly adopted, you still have this dampening factor that would offset or counterbalance any of that. Yes?
You talked about the way to change this was healthcare being more affordable, encouraging people to have more children, but there's a long process to raising a child.
Oh, absolutely.
And a very costly one.
And we have to supplement that with
Yeah, yeah.
Right now, a $500 check in the mail in your tax return is not, motivating people to raise kids. And we have to do a lot more to address the big problems that are causing people to not have children or decide not to raise them.
And what do you think some of those big problems are?
Well, we definitely have income inequality issues in the United States and across the world. When you look at the Gini coefficient, which is it's kind of like a ratio of how much wealth is dispersed in the hands of how many people, we have very high Gini coefficients, which means that we have, as we know, a lot of the wealth is in the hands of very few people. Now, I'm not advocating for total socialist redistribution of wealth, but there are definitely things that we can do to drive the Gini down and make life in general more affordable. And when life is affordable, when times are good, people are going to start raising families, they're going to have more kids, things like that.
Thanks.
Yeah.
I know you looked in terms of productivity, but what are the implications this has on resource exploitation in terms of increasing the population and an already overpopulated Earth?
Oh, so you mean if the population were to increase, how many resources would we exploit?
Yeah.
Well, we definitely would have to use more. I didn't look into that much. I'd imagine that it would increase because when you think about our lifestyles today, everybody uses a cell phone, and all those cell phones have all these very rare earth elements that are mined in places like Kenya or China, and they're very expensive. And there's some ethical issues with that mining process. Just as one example, if we promote more children, you're going to have more people that consume just cell phones, and this is just one industry. That means more mining. That means more exploitation. So there are definitely things that have to be done across the world in terms of resource management. But I think first and foremost, we have to make sure that the economy continues to grow, because if you can't do that, then you don't have the comfort to focus on other things like that.
All right, well, thank you very much. All right.
So I think I have two faculty members to introduce this time, Dr. Scott Castle and Jared Paul. Nope, I'm getting a signal. It's only one. Yes. Oh, I skipped one. I'm so sorry. I'm going back. Thank you. Relax for a moment. First, I'm going to introduce Grace Maresca on behalf of her faculty mentor, Dr. Gina Talley. Thank you, Gina. Grace is a triple major in history, political science, and humanities, and a scholar in the honors program. This work, Underrepresented and Misunderstood, published Radical Women in the 1850s and 1890s, is her honors senior thesis. After first meeting Grace in a U.S. history course that she took with me in the fall of 2023, I was thrilled when she approached me to write her honors thesis in history. Her interest in this topic, most specifically gender ideals in the mid-1800s in the U.S., began as a paper she wrote in that course. It has been wonderful to see the development in her thinking over the past 2 years, especially in the last year while working on her thesis. Grace's hard work and dedication to this year-long research project have been most impressive. Her willingness to get lost and found in the rabbit holes of history, as well as in the footnotes of history, has been a true joy to spend time discussing. I know her outstanding research and writing skills will serve her well in the next stage of her educational path. In the fall, Grace will be beginning a master's degree in political science in Amsterdam, with a specialized focus on democracy, power, and inequality. Congratulations to her for this well-deserved honor and recognition. Please welcome me in welcoming Grace.
Good afternoon. My name is Grace Maresca, and today I will be presenting my research, Underrepresented and Misunderstood, Radical Published American Women of the 1850s to 1890s. So here's a brief overview of what I'm going to be covering in this topic, but before I start, I want to note that I'm extremely abbreviating my work, which is over 100 pages of written material, to accommodate for the limited time of this presentation. So to begin, during the early 1800s, women in the United States had very few legal rights. They couldn't vote, hold office, access higher education, or pursue professional careers. Dissatisfied with their restricted social rules, some older and middle-class white women began to reject the cult of true womanhood. The cult of true womanhood, which was the dominant ideal, emphasized piety, purity, submissiveness, and domesticity. So these women turned to creative outlets, such as newspapers and periodicals, to challenge societal norms and to advocate for change. My research focuses on 2 women-owned operated newspaper publications, looking at the 1850s to 1890s, which was a pretty radical sentiment at that time. By recovering voices often excluded from mainstream history, this work deepens understanding of the feminist press and how it was a powerful force for gender equality. It also demonstrates how print media served as a crucial platform for resistance, challenging dominant gender ideologies and advocating for social justice. For the methodology, this paper employs a cultural history approach, drawing on an audience and reader response theory, as well as a cultural exchange theory. This paper analyzes articles, announcements, and editorials closely to uncover how feminist discourse in print mobilized individuals towards collective action and community building. The theories were inspired by Thaw's The Imagined Civil War and Janice Radway's Reading the Romance. The Lily and the Women's Journal, the 2 newspapers of which I looked at, each covered different years during the late 19th century and functioned as more than just a newspaper publication. They became an interactive platform and fostered a shared identity and purpose among geographically dispersed suffragettes and women, uniting them in a common cause. The Lily, published from 1849 to 1859, provides early insight into the discussions and arguments of suffragettes and reformers. Amelia Bloomer founded the Lily in Seneca Falls, New York, and noted that its purpose was to be devoted to the emancipation of women from intemperance, injustice, prejudice, and bigotry. The Lily used gendered rhetoric to frame arguments, often relying on sex-based concepts to appeal to their contemporary audience, and to reflect how such ideas were understood at that time. Building on early feminist publications such as The Lily, the Woman's Journal was founded by Lucy Stone in 1870. It was another like-minded woman-operated newspaper. Impressively, longer than any other women-owned and operated newspaper, it ran for 61 years, ceasing publication in 1931. My research focuses on select articles looking at the years 1870 to 1890 for this publication. This is an especially significant period, as just 1 year earlier, in 1869, the 15th Amendment had passed. While it prohibited denying the right to vote based on race, it notably excluded women, leading to a deep rift within the movement. During this time, the Women's Journal adopted a more assertive tone, reflecting the growing frustration and urgency that these suffragettes felt. Still, it also strategically and occasionally connected the case for women's suffrage to traditional gender roles, helping make the movement's goals more relatable and acceptable to broader and more conservative audiences. In the interest of time, I'll give a quick overview of the thematic analysis I conducted. My paper focuses on 4 key themes that came up consistently across the newspapers. First, the limited social status of women during this period. Second, their ongoing struggle for basic human rights, rights that were denied to them simply because they were women. Third, the use of religious arguments as a way to claim agency and moral authority. And finally, the push for dress reform, which challenged restrictive clothing norms and symbolized a broader fight for bodily autonomy and freedom. Now let's shift focus to one of the most controversial aspects of early feminists, dress reform and the backlash it faced in the 1850s to 1870s. Dress reform is a key focus of my analysis. It is a rich, complex topic that evolved over time and faced major resistance. Reformers like Amelia Bloomer pushed for alternatives to restrictive fashion, seen here. Though she entered in the movement unintentionally, her support for the Bloomer costume in the Lily sparked national attention, and aka Bloomers, she won the title for it. In the mid-1800s, Americans shifted from word-of-mouth news to widespread newspaper consumption. Newspaper growth exploded from having 1,631 publications in 1840 to over 2,526 by the 1850s, circulating nearly 500 million copies for just over 20 million people. This media boom played a crucial role in spreading discussions on dress reform and suffrage. However, the movement, especially the idea of women wearing trousers, triggered fierce backlash. Historian Cunningham notes that this style directly challenged deeply ingrained gender norms. Women in trousers, pants, were often ridiculed, sexualized, or even perceived as threats to the patriarchal order. In response, mainstream cartoons like Harper's 1851 Women's Emancipation, as seen here, mocked women adopting reform dress, reinforcing rigid gender roles and the ideals of true womanhood. These visuals underscore just how threatening this reform was perceived, particularly when it came to undermining traditional domestic roles and feminist ideals. Between 1888 and 1891, the suffrage movement took a major step forward with the formation of the National American Women's Suffrage Association. This unification brought together previously divided groups, creating a more powerful and coordinated national effort. Nevertheless, during this period, even challenging beauty standards were seen as a radical act. Femininity was closely tied to appearance, for both men and women, and these expectations were often used as a tool to control women and to suppress their voice. In 1891, Henry Blackwell, Lucy Stone's husband, wrote a powerful article titled "Fashion's Slaves," where he openly criticized restrictive women's fashion as a grotesque, inconvenient, and obstructive movement. He made bold comparisons between fashion and slavery, arguing that beauty standards functioned as a tool of control rather than expressions of individuality. Blackwell didn't hold back. He challenged male readers, urging them to imagine a life confined by hoop skirts to better understand the toll restrictive clothing it took on women's health and freedom. He went further by questioning the very notion of beauty, describing it as something natural, a gift, not something that can be shaped or distorted by fashion trends. His core message was clear, though, and one that would come up consistently throughout the text. True emancipation for women would only be possible when they were freed not just from political oppression, but also from the physical societal constraints of their clothing and suppressed roles. So, what did these publications really achieve? First, they strategically pushed back against traditional gender norms by blending familiar ideas of femininity with their bolder form. They made their message more accessible and harder to dismiss. Even though they were connected to mainstream values in some way, they also managed to promote women's health, independence, personal agency, and dress reform. And most importantly, these newspaper publications gave women a space to question the world, to imagine something different, and to start reshaping what it meant to be a woman in society. In the end, these periodicals educated, united, and empowered women, laying the foundation for a reimagined vision of womanhood. Now I'd like to welcome any questions.
What was the frequency of these periodicals?
Frequency? So they changed. So they started off as weekly newspapers, but then they would change based on like readership and how much money they were coming in. So they would either be monthly or weekly.
What was their readership?
That's hard to tell you. They were pretty popular, especially the Women's Journal, since it was able to run for 61 years. So in that sense, it was able to maintain itself for that period of time, which was remarkable for newspapers. But there's no data on the readership because that's such an early time, and that's literally the spark of when newspapers became a phenomenon in the United States.
Do you know much about their funding source, whether it was subscription or advertisement?
Yeah, so that's kind of one of my favorite topics. So in a different world, if I could redo my presentation, I would probably focus in on the role their husbands played, especially since I'm analyzing medical women during a time when they really didn't have rights. Their husbands provided a large part of the funding for it. Their personal wealth, they did get a lot of in the sense they were able to maintain themselves from their readership, so they were gaining income from that. But yeah, their husbands played a pretty significant role, and I would just like to pick their brains and see why these men were persistent in helping these women.
And I guess the way that funding sources might shape what's in the newspaper, right?
That is true. There were a lot of advertisements that made me think it was more geared towards mainstream values. But thinking at this time, that's also pretty normal because they have to balance it. They can't come out and just say yeah, women deserve rights. Although today we understand that and that's more natural, at that time that was unheard of, unthinkable. So they're playing. It's kind of like a tool. They're playing with what they have. So by presenting the mainstream norms and providing those advertisements, they're adhering and trying to pull in their more conservative audience.
Any other questions? Well, thank you very much.
Yeah. Okay. Now I'm going to invite Dr. Scott Castle and Jared.
Just one.
Or just one.
So it's a privilege to be able to introduce Haley Bierling. Haley, I've known since her first day on campus, and and then it took her about 3 months before she would actually say any words to me. This is while she was in my class. But then she started doing research really early, at the end of her first semester, and has been very productive ever since. Her first reaction was making something, and she caught the synthesis bug, and it's hard to stop her from making stuff in the lab. And so she's been a Goldwater recipient. She's spoken at our national meeting of our ACS just this past year as an undergrad, which is quite remarkable. And I can't really say enough about her. Her project has led to a deep collaboration between Jared and myself, including others at other institutions like Lehigh and University of Minnesota. Her work led to an NSF proposal, which is really hard to do these days, funding-wise, but she's going to be first author on a paper that we hope to submit next week. She'll probably have at least one more paper. And she's going to talk a little bit about what she's done in the last 6 months, maybe. So, Haley.
Thank you, Dr. Campbell, for that introduction, and thank you to the Falvey Library for allowing me to speak today. My name is Haley Bierling. I work for Dr. Scott Castle and Dr. Jared Paul in the chemistry department. Today I'm going to be telling you a little bit about my thesis work, progress towards enhanced electron transfer in bimetallic complexes. So a lot of what our lab is interested in is these photocatalytic systems. So if we think about a photocatalyst, we're basically using light to excite these molecules and use that energy to drive these really high energy reactions. If you think about this practically, we could use like fossil fuel sources or really high electrical charges, but that is not necessarily sustainable when we're thinking about climate change and trying to move towards greener solutions, which is why we go towards light. So we can just use the sun. So with the photocatalytic system, we tend to have multiple species working together, trying to go through these catalytic processes. When you have multiple species working together, this comes with challenges because you're trying to get all these processes to happen at the same time. So the thought is, how do we make this process simpler? So instead of having multiple species, what if we change the system and just had one? So instead of these multiple species, we connect them through different types of interactions or bonding. So rather than having to worry about diffusion within a system where all these molecules colliding, we just have to worry about charge getting from one end to the other. This does, however, come with more challenges. As you add more and more to these systems, there's more places that this charge could go. There's a lot of researchers trying to study catalytic systems like this. But once you get into catalysis, it adds even more challenges. So our thought is, what if we simplify the system? So instead of looking at catalysts, we just look at complexes, which leads me into the work that I started with my first year at Villanova. So we've decided to connect these two ruthenium metal centers and try to see if they can talk to each other. We do this by using a bridging ligand, in this case tetrapride of phenazine, or TPPHC. So that's our bridge between these two ruthenium metal centers, and then we have these periphery ligands on the outside. We're able to vary the electronic nature of these periphery ligands with different substituents, so more electron donating, pushing charge towards the metal center, versus more electron withdrawing, so that's going to pull the charge away. With this, we're trying to understand the electronic effects and see if these two ruthenium metal centers can actually talk to each other, which is what we need for catalysis to be possible. So what we've learned with TPPHC as a bridge is that a few different processes are actually occurring. With 4 of our 5 complexes, what we see is that some of the charge is populating onto that TPPHC ligand, and then we see it being trapped or blocked by that central ring, which is a pyrazine ring, rather than going across the bridge to the other metal center. and then we just see relaxation back down to our ground state. However, with the final system with our most electron withdrawing substituents, we don't see any population onto the bridging ligand. We rather simply see population of the periphery ligand set. Now, all of this is very exciting because it means that we can potentially direct electron transfer within these systems by changing the ligand environment. So it leads us to the question of how do we further direct charge transfer within these systems so that we can hopefully build better catalysts. There's a lot of different ways we can do this. I don't have time to talk about everything today, but one option is to change the bridge. Quite simply, we're starting with TPPHC, which has a central ring with 2 nitrogens. What if we took one out and replaced it with a carbon? Then we have a completely different bridging ligand, tetracratoacridine, or TPAC, which hopefully could solve the problem of blocking that charge in the middle and allow us to communicate from one ruthenium metal to the other. So to make these complexes, I start out with 110 nanothalene 5-amine with paraformaldehyde in 6 molar hydrochloric acid, heat that at 70 degrees Celsius for 8 days, and I'm able to cleanly isolate my ligand with moderate yields. I then take my ligand and ruthenium, this by purity, dichloride salts, whichever I need for my respective periphery ligand set, and 1:1 ethanol water. I heat that at 150 degrees Celsius for around 15 minutes in a microwave reactor, and I'm able to cleanly isolate my target complexes, first as PF6 salts, and then I do a salt metathesis to get to a chloride salt. Now we characterize these complexes numerous different ways, a lot to study their electronic properties, as well as just to confirm what we thought we made. We do proton NMR of each of our bimetallic complexes, first to confirm that we made what we thought we made, and then also I'm able to assign the hydrogen atoms using proton NMR. So you'll see I've highlighted a few of the atoms specific to those on the TPAC ligand. But we can obviously assign the full complexes. There's clearly a lot going on here. So next, for our cyclic voltammetry, this is allowing us to look at what would happen if we removed an electron from the system or added an electron to the system, and then how much energy it actually takes to do that. So what we observe is a 2-electron redox couple for our ruthenium-3, ruthenium-2 couple, which is 1 electron on either ruthenium metal center. And what we actually observe is around a half a volt difference between our most electron donating substituents to our most electron withdrawing substituents. So if you think about a AAA battery, which has around 1.5 volts, that's a pretty substantial amount of energy. So that gives us a lot of room to play with for our chemistry. Here's just some summary data. We also have done mass spectrometry, which allows us again to confirm that we made what we thought we made. So UV visible spectroscopy, this is allowing us to see what happens when we shine light at our molecules. So with our lowest energy transition, so it's going to be at the highest wavelength, is our metal to ligand charge transfer band, or MLCT. We observe that the lowest energy, so highest wavelength, is going to be the most electron donating substituents for our periphery ligand set, which is generally what we would expect with these complexes. Then if we'll look in that region between 325 and 375 nanometers, what you'll observe is that for the most electron withdrawing, so the CF3 BIPI, you see no transitions, but when we go all the way over to the methoxy BIPI, the MEO BIPI, you observe 2 transitions, which those 2 transitions are much more analogous to what we observe with the TPPHC complexes. So we're already starting to observe differences just in looking at the visible spectroscopy. Then, because it's me, I decided to run UV visible spectroscopy in sulfuric acid. I increased the concentration, and as I increase to a more acidic environment, you actually see the growth of new transitions in, which is an incredible result for us, and it leads us to believe that we might potentially be protonating that central ring, so adding a hydrogen to the nitrogen of the TPAC ligand. I'm still continuing to work on this. I will finish it before I graduate. We also get to do some photoluminescence, so think we hit the molecules with light, and then we look at the light that they actually give off, which is really exciting because not all the TPHC complexes actually do limit mass. So this we do observe modest trends and shifting with each of the complexes, which is very exciting, and this is something that I'm continuing to work more on before I graduate. And then finally, some transient absorption spectroscopy. This is actually what we do with our collaborators at Lehigh University. It's a really, really complex technique. They use probe delays with lasers, but what we end up observing with this is that the bipyridine TPAC complex, so this is just our neutral complex, what we use to compare to everything else, behaves much more similarly to the trifluoromethyl TPHC complex. We wouldn't necessarily initially believe them to be analogous, but the fact that they are means that we are starting to understand how we can possibly manipulate charge transfer within these complexes simply by altering the ligand environment. So, in summary, we've been able to compare three of these complexes with tetrapyroactine as the bridging ligand. Started doing some initial characterization of these complexes, trying to continue this and get more work done before I graduate. And we're starting to observe similar excited state pathways to what we've observed with some of the TPHC complexes, which is allowing us to better understand this charge transfer in these systems, hopefully allowing us to build better catalysts. A lot of people to thank. Everybody in the Paul and Castle groups, we have grown exponentially. Dr. Paul and Dr. Castle for somehow allowing me to stay in the labs for 4 years, our collaborators at Lehigh and the University of Minnesota Crookston, and then all the support that I've received from various organizations at Villanova.
So you graduate May 16th.
Yes.
You got a lot of work to do, it sounds like, between now and then.
Yes.
Fascinating. Fascinating.
Keep it done, hopefully.
I'm curious, since you've got all this research planned, until you graduate, what are your plans for after you graduate?
So I will be pursuing my PhD. I'm going to be attending Princeton University.
Congratulations.
In chemistry.
In chemistry, yes.
What sort of applications are there? Are we thinking about batteries or?
So we tend to think about catalysts as like water oxidation. So we think generally like water splitting, taking water and going into like equivalents of hydrogen and oxygen and then using that as a fuel source. I also think in terms of like taking CO2 and going to something like methanol. That could be potential for catalysts that we could form the design of. Currently, we're not designing those catalysts yet, or at least I'm not. Other people in our group have been working on water oxidation catalysts. But this work, in terms of bimetallic complexes, once you add a second metal center, everything just gets even more complicated. And so we decided to just focus on understanding things at a fundamental level before we start scaling up.
Well, thank you very much, Haley. So it is my pleasure to introduce our two final Falvey Scholars who worked on a joint project, Eric Rigo and Rachel Sabadini. Their faculty member, Dr. Maria Himon, wrote the following. I am delighted that Rachel Sabadini and Eric Rigo have been selected as Falvey Scholars. I met them during their first year of college when we started working together on a project through the first year match program, which connects students with professors and introduces them to research early in their time at Villanova. The project I proposed would use data from the Great British Bake Off, and I initially expected Rachel and Eric to spend the bulk of their semester compiling that data, aka watching over 100 episodes of the Great British Bake Off. Instead, they worked really quickly and had the data in just a couple of weeks. She speculates that maybe the topic and wanting to know who ended up as being star baker in each episode was really the motivation. But this allowed us to collaborate further as Rachel dove into the data analysis and econometrics while learning Stata, a program that economists often use for our analysis. And Eric took a first crack at the literature review, finding papers through Falvey's journal subscriptions in both economics and psychology that discuss serial position biases and writing about them. It was a pleasure working with both of them on this project, and it brings me great joy as a professor that Eric and Rachel get to graduate with a publication. In their 4 years at Villanova, they went through all the stages of academic research, from data collection to being published in an academic journal this past January. And now we've come full circle as their article can be accessed through Falvey Library. Please join me in welcoming Eric and Rachel.
Thank you for that introduction, and thank you for Falvey Library to give us the opportunity to talk about our research. So I'm Rachel Sabdini.
I'm Eric Rigo. And in collaboration with Professor Mira Himmel.
Our research was the serial position bias among experts, and we took evidence from a cooking competition show. So brief introduction. So the Great British Bake Off, for those of you who don't know, is a popular amateur cooking competition show, and its design offers an opportunity for analyzing serial position bias among expert rankings. In our paper, we used the technical challenge portion of the show to assess whether experts, in this case the judges in the show, are susceptible to the primacy or recency effects.
Yeah, there's been previous literature on the effect of order in different parts of our society. So, for example, when there was a study looking at Super Bowl commercials, they found that the ones that aired towards the start of the game were remembered better than the ones towards the middle or the last. For elections, the candidate that's posted first tends to get more votes. And also, more particularly for us, is this particular wine study. Essentially, it took a group of wine experts and gave them the same wine. They just dyed it with different food dyes, and then asked it to rank it. And they found consistently that the one that was shown first consistently got higher rankings, despite it being the same wine.
So now to introduce a little bit more about what the technical portion of the show is about. A couple images kind of to describe it, but they're given really brief instructions, and this is what the end of the technical portion looks like when they're finished with their bakes. Sometimes the directions are given by the judges are not very specific. As you can see, it just says bake. So to dive a little bit more into depth about it, so in order to collect the data, we watch the technical challenge portion of each episode. And so what happens is that all contestants are required to bake the same dish from a pared down recipe provided by the judges. And then when the allotted time is over, the contestants come and place their dish on a randomly assigned spot on the judging table. And the judges are not present while the contestants are baking, nor do they know who baked which dish when they're judging. And so they move from their right to their left, taste each dish, and then they rank them from worst to best. And to create our data set, we've recorded where each contestant's assigned place was on the table, and then also recorded the order in which they were ranked by the judges. And a quick background as to why we chose the Great British Bake Off. It's because it involves blind tasting, which eliminates some of the bias that might occur. It involves two expert judges who have experience in baking fields. The order was apparent, and the order distribution was random, and we were able to collect, as I mentioned, over 100 observations.
Yeah, in addition to the normal Great British Bake Off, as the professor mentioned, we went beyond it. We started looking for the more international versions, all the English-speaking versions. So we have one from South Africa, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Kenya, and this allowed us to get around over 200 episodes of data were collected. And the reason why we were able to do this is because the structure of the show stays quite consistent, and particularly the technical challenge stays the same no matter what version of the show you're watching. And our big finding is that being the first dish tasted meant that you were more likely to be in the higher rank, to have a higher rank, than being either in the middle or the last. And it's particularly meant that you are about 29% more likely to end up in the top half of the ranking compared to any other position. And this essentially means that there's some type of primacy bias or bias towards the first in these judges.
So this figure shows the ranking distribution for the dishes tasted first, second, last, and otherwise, and it's a kernel density distribution. So using the data, and it's showing the data from both Great British Bake Off and the international versions that had at least 5 contestants remaining. So the x-axis here is representative of the scaled ranking of the dish, 0 being the best, 1 being the worst, and the y-axis represents the density of the ranking, so how frequently dishes receive certain scores. And two notable statistics from this are that 29% of the dishes tasted first were subsequently ranked by the judges in the top quintile, while only 15% of dishes tasted first were ranked in the bottom quintile. And so this table shows a lot of different data, but main focus is panel A, which shows that dishes tasted first are statistically significantly more likely to be ranked higher by Great British Bake Off judges than those tasted later.
And another big finding was this effect was more prominent the more contestants there were. Because a part of the Great British Bake Off is that someone gets eliminated each episode. So then we consistently see less and less people. So we're able to explore the effect due to the number of contestants. And one of the reasons we're thinking is that other biases might creep up more when there's less and less people, overpowering the primacy effect. That's why it shows less and less of an effect. And we explored a couple mechanisms in regards to that. The first thing is, we thought that it might just be an idea of something called taste building. Essentially, when you first have a certain flavor, whether it be sweet, savory, the first try of that, it's phenomenal, it's a great effect. The second one's not as good as the first, and then subsequently just keeps, the effect of it keeps going down and down and down. Because maybe your taste buds get used to the taste, and it's not as effective. The next mechanism we looked at was the idea of satiety. So, as you can see here, there's 12 dishes. Whether you're having 1, 2, 3 pieces, if you're going all the way down, you're going to get more and more full. And I think everyone here could say, the more hungry you are, the better a dish tastes. But our last mechanism, and the one we think is the most consistent, is called the benchmark mechanism. Essentially, the judges try this dish, and they use that as their benchmark, what this type of dish should be. So instead of judging them on other characteristics, they look at that first dish and be like, this is how this cake should be. Anything that deviates too much from it may go against their initial benchmark. And the reason why we're so confident about the last mechanism is because we also looked at first, third, second effects. And in the kernel, you can see that being second really had a similar distribution to being last or being in the middle. We also looked at being in the first half, and we found that had no real effect in being in the middle third or in the last third. And if it was satiety or taste fatigue, we would see a decline in this effect. We only see it in the first one, therefore making the benchmark mechanism probably our strongest mechanism taste-wise.
So for anyone interested or invested in the Great British Bake Off, we want to assure you that this bias doesn't really affect the overall outcomes of the show, as there's 3 different challenges typically within each episode, and it seems that the technical plays the smallest role in how judges decide whether contestants are moving on or not.
And now, some big takeaways for you guys. Oftentimes, expert opinions are used to make certain decisions, whether it be buying a car, buying a house. And we like to often think that these are experts. They shouldn't be subject to bias. But our paper, as long as the previous literature has shown that, yes, these experts are subject to bias, like normal people. And we need to take that into consideration when we're making our decisions. And our paper does go a little bit beyond the previous literature, because we also looked at culinary bias, and we also looked at what a group of experts, because there's 2 judges in every decision, that bias is still there, despite there being a group or more than one person in the experts panel. Now, for all of you, we want to take this opportunity to encourage you guys to go first. Take that. Because, look, I think we've all had that feeling where we get scared before a big presentation. We want to go in the middle, maybe the last, see how other people do. But I believe you should go first. Leave that lasting impact, so you can show people your true talent. And now, I understand the irony. I'm encouraging you to go first, despite me being left. Really no. Thank you.
In watching the show, though, don't you kind of I mean, the number of episodes the both of you watched, don't you kind of catch on that every time they take the first one, they like it the best? I mean, don't the viewers catch on to that? The contestants?
I can only speak for myself. I didn't.
No?
But to be honest, the way after a while you get really good at just knowing what parts you need. Because you need the order, you need the results. So I'm not watching the full episode. I'm watching like specific parts.
Okay.
Yeah, that's why I shouldn't mention that. Yes.
So from all the pictures that you showed, it looks like it's the same two judges across every episode. Do you have a way to discern whether it's not just these two judges that have this bias and that it could be an industry-wide issue?
So,
I could just start with that. Well, that's why we also incorporated the international versions, because those all have a different set of judges for each country. And then also, I believe the judges change a little bit throughout the show, so it's looking at data beyond just two judges for all of these episodes. Yeah.
and also the group, which one changed? One of them rapidly left in the middle of it. Like, yeah, so one of the judges actually got swapped out. And then towards the later episodes, they have a new judge. So, yeah. Yes.
You mentioned that, you were looking at the judging pairs. I know that occasionally on that show, they would have somebody who did the technical by themselves, somebody got sick.
Yeah.
So did you include those or not? And, did you notice any difference when it's only one judge instead of, multiplex?